It didn't start on October 7th. October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. And many other phrases like this have been used a lot by what I would basically call pro-Hamas propagandists to basically try to excuse what has happened on October 7th. I don't think there's any other way to pretty much go around it. But uh, today on the reality show, we will be discussing sort of what the motivation behind people who say that. And we'll be also going through some of the history of the people who like to use this phrase and what is the history that has happened before October 7th, at least according to them. So joining me today is Michael, Marco, and Richard. Hey guys. And let me start with Marco today. When have you heard this phrase the first time? History didn't start on October 7th, and what were your sort of like, what was your immediate reaction?
Oh God, surely happens after October 7th. Um, I don't know. I kind of when I hear this kind of phrases, this kind of catchphrases, this kind of rhyming bollocks, I tend to ignore. I don't really latch on it because it's quite self-evident that somebody who says something like that is effectively, the translation. You don't have to be an intellectual to work this one out. The translation is, yes, October the 7th, 1,200 people were slaughtered one by one. 250 people were taken by the Gazan and still held by the Gazan in Gaza. But the other side, Israel, surely they've done something wrong as well. They can't claim to be um, victims because probably at some point they've done something like that. So all this kind of argument are just designed to minimize what's actually happened because most people probably would flip out if they rationalize in their head what's happened October 7th, if they accepted that the side that they support, the side that they consider being the victim and the weakest one, is the side that caused this kind of carnage, really. Um, and part of it is that they do not think. They are unable to integrate facts and understand exactly what's happening, and they even refuse to talk about it because doing that, I mean, I don't mean to psychologize, a big chunk of the population, but doing that would be um, going against what's been ingrained in their psychology, what their feelings are, and how they feel about things that they perceive in a certain way. So they couldn't possibly stick to the raw facts because the raw facts would jar with what they think they know.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, the purpose here is to make sure that you don't start by talking about the brutality and the barbarity of the actions of the Gazans and the Palestinians and Hamas within them, all three, whichever way you split it, on October the 7th. Because as Marcus said, it's hard to paint the underdog when they're also causing mass murder and rape like that. And of course, one of the motivations here is to make sure that you don't start with that, and then you can understand the self-defense as a response. But of course, you want to, or these people who peddle this line, they want to go further back, but they want to be extremely selective about which parts of which bits of history they pick out and when they choose their random starting date, but by the same argument. What they don't recognise, of course, in the course of that, is the pattern, which is relevant throughout the decades, which is Palestinian violence and terrorism. Indiscriminate rocket fire from Arab land, whether it's in Gaza or whatever, into Israel, and Israel having to respond to it, having to defend itself against that. That's the pattern that is clear every time. And this is an example of that pattern starting from October the 7th, but it's a particularly heinous example because it's a surprise attack, and a surprise attack of such a barbarity and severity as this one is what starts this war. yes, the whole region has had a lot of conflict in it for many decades, and each of those wars can be examined in that format as being a response to Palestinian violence, or of course Arab violence from surrounding countries, depending on which particular war we're talking about. But if you're focusing on this one, it's the fact that it's a response, a self-defense response, and of course that's why people don't want to start at this point, because they want to paint Israel as an aggressor that is suddenly deciding to go into Gaza and destroy buildings in Gaza without a reason, other than, of course, it being racist as they paint the Israelis. And of course, the events of October the 7th are the reason, and the desire to stop another October the 7th is the motivation.
So some of you might be thinking Richard has sort of exaggerated a bit in the last sentence. Like, no one would claim, Israel is just randomly doing this. So we'll go through one of the article which had, let's say, a telling of I'm not even sure if history, but had a telling of things that have happened in the past, which are sort of interesting. But before we go into that and a few more other things, let me just quickly go to Michael.
Yeah, I think when I first heard it was more in association with some of the remarkably despicable testimony that the so-called leaders of Harvard and Columbia and so on gave in front of Congress, that this sufficed. This was the explanation for the context. This whole notion that history didn't begin on October 7th, that we had to look at the context. What was never looked at, of course, in that context, first of all, is the fact that the Palestinians have been offered a separate state for a very long time on multiple occasions, numerous occasions, which is, of course, not part of the humanitarian teaching at any liberal arts university that any of us are aware of, and forms the wonderful basis for this contention that what was done is in the least bit excusable. It's clearly not. But the context that's been provided by these again so-called leaders, and they're all learning from the same textbooks, is that there's a group of people that are oppressed, and that group of people should use whatever means is necessary to, eliminate their oppressors. It doesn't ever blame the oppressed. It doesn't ever blame anything they do, and it excuses atrocities that would make anybody cry. And that's basically what they have done. And when you have the leaders of universities, some of the formerly the most prestigious universities, standing up in front of Congress and televised events saying this was all acceptable because, then you can see how this would happen. So that's the way they look at it. That's when I first really heard about this notion that history didn't start, was when we learned about some things are okay depending on the context.
Yeah, and something that it sort of reminded me of, and that's why when I put it into these words, you see how disgusting it is. Like, imagine watching the news and seeing a report about, someone like hurting their spouse, like beating up their spouse. And your question is, well, what did they do beforehand? This is basically what people are saying when they ask, when they say history didn't happen on October 7th. Well, what did Israel do to deserve this? Is basically what these people are saying. And yeah, it's truly terrible. And, yesterday we have talked about Mehdi Hassan, and, he was saying how, in a sense, Israel is prolonging this, is letting this happen. Something he mentioned is the fact that, Hamas was willing to sign a ceasefire, to do a ceasefire, like 2 days after October 7th. And again, this sort of mentality basically is saying just Israel should just give up. It should just either let itself be killed, or basically eradicate all of the Jews from the area. Basically, everyone should just leave. There is no sort of place basically to move from. And I think we'll go into the history, but something that I think is really important, and the point I want to make, and I want to ask you guys about it, especially because I think it's sort of so. Also, Robert has been a member for 28 months. Thank you so much. And I think his comment helps me make this point. He says, "True to the our title, which is History Didn't Start on October 7. True, but history also didn't start in 47 nor 48. History didn't start in June 1967, obviously. Who's respecting the full context? Hint, we are." And something I think is important is, at least something I think for me important make is, I think these people who try to focus too much on the history, and whenever you talk to these pro-Palestinians, they almost exclusively just talk about the history. But when it comes to this, there's no other conflict that is dealt with like that. Instead of focusing, like, what is the reality now? What is the situation right now? What is the Israeli country? How is the Israeli regime right now? And what are the groups representing the Palestinian interest? Who are the people who support the Palestinians? What are the ideas? What are the Palestinians pushing for? Instead of focusing on anything like this, they are just focusing on what happened again in the past. There is, again, people have been, in a sense, ethnically cleansed, even if you want to go there, from all over the place. People after the Second World War, Germans were kicked out of all over the place. Japanese people have been moved all around. Yet you don't have this sort of almost like a revisionist movements trying to bring back. You don't have, people, in a sense, especially after you lose a war, you sort of accept it and you build from what you have now. Yet this is something we've never seen with the Palestinians. And I think the focus on history is enforcing this, basically telling them, no, you do deserve this. You should endlessly fight against the Israelis until you can win whatever goal you want by force. You should never agree to any sort of state, as Michael said earlier. You should never try to be a free, rights-respecting nation. You should support whatever radicals you have in your society to build, to create your Islamic State. And I think this is something that's very problematic with people who sort of almost like fetishize history instead of like, what can we move from now on? And just last point I would make is, I'm slowly like trying to learn sort of like this history, and obviously I don't think Israel was. There's no way in history like Israel was always in the right. Especially Israel is not even always right now. It's still not fully respecting society as we want. Just comparatively, it is much better, and it always has been much better comparatively. But again, if in the past Israel was in the wrong, that wouldn't justify completely eradicating all the people living in the area. It wouldn't justify eradicating one of the only free states in the Middle East. But yeah, I've talked for a long, so I'm wondering what you guys think. Let me start the other way now. Let me start with Michael. What do you think about the sort of what I would call almost like fetishization of history or over focus on history?
No, people are their masters of their own destiny. When you have a problem, I mean, look at Vietnam. They had a terrible war there. The South was relatively wealthier. The North was not. Ultimately, the U.S. effectively lost and left. And you ended up with a merged country that has decided that it's going to be communist in government and effectively capitalist, a quiet capitalist, because if you say anything wrong, you're going to disappear, or at least potentially disappear. But they decided to move on. And they decided that we have to try to make a country that can take care of its people and that people can live in. And even if the government is obviously hypocritical, that we're going to still understand that you cannot build a country on communism because there's no way to redistribute wealth that doesn't exist. You actually have to create wealth first, and then you can try to redistribute it. Other countries have done the same thing. The irony is that the Arabs, that what people are looking for, the Sharia law that Islamic militants are looking for, is not only moving back recently, but it's trying to move people back to the Middle Ages. And as you say, they fetishize it, but it's actually quite a bit worse. It's delusional. You cannot maintain a modern society with anywhere near the number of people in a population in any area, never mind a small area, if you're using technology that was invented in the Middle Ages. You can't exist in those places. And even if they had a lot more room, you simply couldn't farm enough land, and you couldn't gather enough water. You couldn't do a lot of this stuff to even support the population that you have now. It's just impossible. So how they think moving back to Sharia law, even if they steal everything from the West and so on, will work is beyond me. The fact that they are one of the few peoples left on earth that won't get with it and won't move forward is shocking. And what's even more shocking is the so-called intellectuals are professors. And I think we have to change all the names here, because the professors, what they're professing these days in the humanities is devastating. That these people somehow have a right to exist in Sharia law while stealing everything that the modern world is giving is crazy. So I agree with you. It's just a group of people that has never moved on. The second point I would make is that the fact that not a single Arab country has stepped up to take in any of the Palestinian refugees, not a single one, should be very telling to the rest of the world that the Arabs do not like the Palestinians. In fact, they hate the Palestinians. There are more people let into Europe from the Middle East than there are Palestinians let into the Arab countries. It's crazy. And yet we have these so-called intellectuals supporting the notion that these folks deserve special treatment. And of course, the UN funding, the largest aid organization the UN has is UNRWA. And it's obviously the most corrupt, as often is the case. So I'm completely with you, Daniel. I think it is a complete laugh in the front of reality and facts of what's happened. And there's a good reason that people live in Gaza the way they do. And as long as their leaders continue and they elect those leaders, it will perpetuate itself.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, organizations such as UNRWA are, in a sense, prolonging this conflict. The whole idea that basically Palestinian refugees are sort of refugees indefinitely. There is no, I'm trying to remember the number of the Palestinian registered refugees. It is definitely in the millions. But the fact that Europe, in a sense, to some extent, was able to, in a sense, basically take, I think, more than 1 million of Syrian refugees, and basically, in a sense, at least spread them around and sort of accept them. Yet there is no such goal for the Palestinians. There's no will again. And again, it's always the Europe, in a sense, that has to take the refugees. There's no, you have about 200 countries. If we spread the people around, we can somehow figure it out. But there's no willingness to actually do anything about these refugees. They are being held as a sort of political tool. That's why the separate organization had to be created. And yeah, this whole thing is just crazy. And I just want to mention, because I'll be bringing up quotes from 3 different articles, so I'll just mention them. So it's one is from Prospect magazine, one is from Indies Times, and one is from Medium. These 3 magazines had a section on this sort of question. History didn't start on October 7th. So we will be talking about that. Just oh, okay. No, I think I'll mention this later. Let me go to Marco now. So yeah, what do you think basically about people sort of the pro-Palestinian crowd, in a sense, obsessing with history?
Yeah, well, these people treat the past like the Fight Club. They don't talk about the past because the past would reveal a series of events which go against the narrative. So what they do instead, they cherry pick a few events and totally disintegrated events, totally causeless. They never analyze what the cause or the event they quote are, but they use the events to kind of signpost a sort of trend that history has followed, which agrees with the narrative. And the narrative is always to deny Israel the right to exist. And of course, by doing this, as Robert was suggesting earlier on, you deny the fact that the two entities we're looking at, Israel and the Palestinian. First of all, the Palestinian is an invention that comes from the 60s, which was needed in order to fight the propaganda war. Because if you just have Israel, a proper state, versus an unknown group of people, that would make it a bit weird. So you create a Palestinian, you start talking a Palestinian state, and you try sneaking in the idea of the solution. But what you're talking about is a state which was invented just to be racist, i.e., a state which is as such just because people belong to a certain ethnicity or they have a certain religion, which is not what happened with Israel. If you tell me Israel has the right to exist because of the God promise, well, I'm going to laugh at your face, because there's no such a thing as a God. And certainly believing in a ghost doesn't give you the right to anything at all. But when you point out that the Constitution of Israel is about a peaceful place where people coexist, that's why 25% of the population in Israel is actually of Arab ethnicity. Even the hostage being released today is of Arab ethnicity, but it was captured in Israel because he lived in Israel. So if you compare the Israel state, a free, loving state, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, certainly not perfect at all, versus a state which has in its own charter the destruction of Israel based on the perceived ethnicity of the people who are the Jews, the state doesn't have any right to exist. You cannot argue in any way in favor of the existence of a state which exists just to destroy somebody else's right, in fact, destroy somebody else's life. So the cherry picking of history, cherry picking of the facts is just there to ignore you focusing on one of the two sides, which is the Palestinian side, which is just there to cause destruction and death.
There's an aim here by the Palestinians to create a fake backstory, by trying to create an origin story, to justify why the villainous behavior on October the 7th was necessary. It's like a Marvel justification for why the psychology was so screwed up that we had to go and kill babies and abduct old people and murder 1,200 people, etc. I think. When we talk about history like this, we've got a challenge on our hands, because whether you're talking about the last 20 years, whether you're talking about the last 75 years or even 100 years, then when you're coming to statements such as who's in the right and who's in the wrong, if you're talking in big sweeps like that, then I think you absolutely can say that Israel has been in the right the whole time. Because the aim of the Palestinians and the Arabs has been to wipe out the state of Israel, to destroy on a racist grounds the entire existence of the Jewish people. Now, that isn't to say that Israel hasn't made some mistakes along the way, some strategic, some moral. Those wouldn't be the ones that the Palestinians would leap on immediately, but those would include things like handing over 1,000 criminals in exchange for one soldier's return as a hostage. That is a strategic and moral mistake. As you could also argue some of the gullibility over some of the accords and the land for peace, and some of the many times that Israel has shown enormous goodwill for a desire to keep its own citizens safe, which has been its aim throughout. as opposed to the desire to annihilate people, which is what the Palestinians have attempted at every stage. And then, of course, so you either talk in the big sweep of things, or you start analysing sections of history, and they do have natural divisions, including, as I said before, when there's an invasion or a terrorist activity which needs to be stopped and responded to ensure that your population remains safe. So each of those has a response, whether it's each of the operations, Operation Protective Edge, for example, or of course, some of the recent, in the past couple of years, the recent past few years, the recent responses to Islamic Jihad coming from Gaza, and the rocket fire coming from Gaza, or of course, rocket fire from South Lebanon and from Hezbollah. In each case, there's a desire to prevent the fact that rockets and death is going to rain on your own people indiscriminately, and you just want to stop that. And if it did stop, that would be the end of it. There would be no need for any further conflict within the region of Gaza or South Lebanon, etc.
So I think we'll slowly go into the articles. Maybe just quickly, someone in the I think it was, oh yeah, someone in the chat is asking, should have Israel drive out all the Arabs following the 67 war? So as we have said, Israel did drive out some of the Arabs, during the Israeli War of Independence, during the first sort of Arab-Israeli conflict. But it did keep some. They were living under military occupation. I think it could have been done if Israel did the occupation right. If it, crushed any sort of dissent. Something I've read about the occupation, that it was, in a sense, meant to be sort of, in a sense, mild, basically making sure that the Arabs in Gaza, so the Palestinians, wouldn't really feel the sort of occupation that has happened after the 67, wouldn't really know much about the IDF presence, wouldn't really see it, instead of actually showing them, no, you have declared war on us, you have failed, and now you are living the consequences of the war. And the only way forward for you is to basically become reformed and civilized, and at some point, not immediately, you will be allowed to have full rights as a citizens. Something that is unique about Israel, or sort of like Israeli recent history, is something that, in a sense, has been happening always, stopped happening, and sort of wasn't, in a sense, allowed to happen in Israel. So, when a country lost in a war and territory was taking over, all the people from there were absolutely expelled. There's no argument about it. That's not something that has been happening in 19th, 18th century. That's something that happened just 3 years before the Israeli War of Independence. After the Second World War, the Germans from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, from Soviet Union were forcibly expelled, and that's something that just was accepted, and that stopped being accepted suddenly after the United Nations was formed. But again, it did create this conflict, this sort of perpetual conflict, and of course Israel didn't help it by not doing the occupation right, because it was able to do it right. We now have 2 million Arab citizens who do enjoy the full rights. But anything you guys like to say before we go to the history, at least according to one of the articles? All right. So I think, I have one. Okay, I'm just going to read it. This one is from In These Times. I think this one is the argument oftentimes used, basically, that occupation just creates more resistance. So I'll read it and I'll ask what you guys think. This is from the article. If the goal is to bring greater security to Israelis, eliminating Arafat or the Palestinian Authority would certainly backfire spectacularly. It would only deepen the Palestinian determination to resist Israeli rule. If it involves Israeli soldiers once again policing the towns of West Bank, it only deepen the it would create new targets for armed resistance. And this is something we have been hearing basically since October 7th, but also before, that basically if Israel does occupy, or if Israel is too strong in its response, basically it just creates more terrorists. And this is just not true according to any sort of historical standard. When America took over Japan, when it started the occupation of Japan, first, before that, it was actively starving the population. It actively worked on completely demoralizing, completely destroying any sort of morale that existed in Japan, not to mention nuking two of their cities. And after that, they did take over. They took over strongly. They said, we will write you a new constitution. We will create your new government, and you will do what we'll tell you. And we will stay until we think it's safe to leave. And after that, they have left. But that allowed, there's no revisionism in Japanese culture about, the evil Americans, similar to Germany. On the other hand, Japanese people idolize the American culture. American culture is viewed as something unique in Japan. And imagine if something like that happened with the Palestinians. Imagine Palestinians, loving Hebrew language, or like really falling in love with the Israeli culture, if it was done right, if it were shown to them that no, you have lost, you have done wrong, and the only way forward is reforming. But this won't really happen. Well, for one, if the Palestinians know that any sort of terrorism will be excused by people in the West, and Israel will be punished for trying to respond in any way, they will actually respond. So this sort of rhetoric of, such as history didn't start on October 7th, is driving Palestinian terrorism, is telling them, you can rape Israelis, we will still stand behind you. We will excuse anything you do because you are justified in anything you do. But let me ask you guys, what do you think? Does strong response from Israel, does occupation just create more resistance, Michael?
So there are 2 million Arabs living in Israel now who enjoy nearly full rights. They're not allowed to be in some of the armed parts of the army. And mostly, I think they're not allowed to be in the Israeli Air Force at this point, but they are allowed to be soldiers. And I'm actually fairly certain they are allowed to carry guns in the army and to fight alongside the Jewish Israelis and the Druze Israelis, who are also part of the army, and so on and so forth. So this is number one. There are 2 million Arabs who have more rights in Israel than they do in almost any other country in the Middle East. That's a fact. So, you're allowed to have any opinion you want, but it ought to square with the facts. If it doesn't square with the facts, we need to toss your opinion. The second point is, and I think you alluded to it, but the reason there hasn't been improvement in the living situation for the people in the Palestinian Authority area and in Gaza is a clash of philosophy, period. This whole thing starts from philosophy. And the philosophy of a militant Islamic group, which is Hamas, and a pretty militant Islamic group, which is the Palestinian Authority, is that we will obey and decree, and our fundamental focus is reestablishing Sharia law or something close to it, and it's for the leaders and not for the people of these countries to enjoy. And what is remarkable in the West is that we cannot understand that it all starts with philosophy. The reason Japan reformed itself is because they've changed philosophy. We didn't just change the constitution there. They changed the philosophy, which was when an emperor tells us to fly a plane into a ship, we're not going to do it. That was a change. When the emperor tells us to go attack China, we're not going to do it. There was a similar change in Germany with the Führer, who was effectively the emperor, and so on and so forth. And until there is a fundamental change in philosophy in that country, and by the way, this is true of all of Iran's tentacles. It's true of many of the Middle Eastern countries who are not under Iran's influence. Until there's a fundamental change in philosophy, which starts with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or some variant thereof, there will always be these kinds of things. The fact these kinds of things being October 7th and the love of being the oppressed victim and not having to actually form a country and create anything of value in the world. This will never change, folks. The fact that there are idiots in America and the rest of the West who are supporting this notion that you can have your cake and eat it too, meaning you can have any philosophy you want and be successful in giving your people a good life if it were only for Israel moving away, is not supported by any reality anywhere, ever. Countries that have done well for their people have respected their people and have decided to put down the guns and create a safe environment for people to flourish and to be productive, which is the beginning to creating wealth. It really all stems from this. The only great quote from one of Netanyahu's recent speeches, because most of them are painful, but one of the great quotes was, "This is not a clash of civilizations. What you're seeing is a clash of barbarism and civilization. And we will never have any improvement in the condition of these people, nor of any other uncivilized people, until their philosophy fundamentally changes and their focus changes."
Marco?
Yeah, the statement that occupation breeds violent resistance is just bollocks to the face of it. I mean, it ignores all sorts of cases in history that you pointed out, a couple of them. Another one, until 1861, Italy was just a peninsula split into lots of states. The Kingdom of Savoy started annexing some of the states, and some states like the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily didn't want to join. So there were a bit of skirmishes, and the Savoy occupied the Papal States. The Pope withdrew within the Vatican, but he never sent around nuns with bombs in order to push back and declare it was occupied. Same for Naples. Despite the south of Italy having a culture which is fairly close to the one in the Middle East, although they're Catholics, the occupation of Savoy never really created any sort of jihadi or intifada or any kind of this kind of violent reaction. And to state that the occupation of parts of the territory in the Middle East breeds violence is just to treat in these areas like they have a different behavior, like there is a sort of determined path that only they will follow and there's no deviation from it. At the same time, okay, then occupation breeds violence. So if you let them be, what's going to happen? What happens when Israel, which cannot be accused of wanting to follow an expansionist policy, because they returned Sinai to Egypt. They gave Gaza to the Arabs. So this is not occupation, is it? It's actually giving them territory. And what did they do with it? They established a government, Hamas, which was explicitly against the existence of Jews or Israeli. So, you see, so if they're occupied, they're going to be violent. If they're not occupied, they can set up their own government, they're going to be violent. Well, perhaps they are violent. Perhaps, as Michael pointed out, what motivates them, what is behind their culture is violence. Could it be the case? God forbid.
Yeah, it always gets me, the fact that this game that's played. How do you both withdraw from a territory and simultaneously occupy it? Because that's often peddled as a lie. I mean, in 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza, and it was up to the Gazans to run the place. But of course, allegedly, because of the failures caused by Hamas spending money on tunnels and weaponry, etc., instead of trying to run a civilized country or civilized territory, they chose it instead to go for the violence every time. I think when we talk about changing the philosophy, the work begins at home, though, because we're not just talking about changing the philosophy of the Palestinians here. We're talking about changing the philosophy within the universities, within the academics, because these people can't conceive of the brutality and the barbarism of the Palestinians on October the 7th. They cannot conceive of it. They can only conceive of barbarism and brutality within the framework of their anti-Semitic viewpoint. Then they can easily accept within their own minds that it's Israel at fault and is indiscriminately causing mass death. But if you take, so the anti-Semitism is right at the core of this, and of course, it's a need to look at get people to change their philosophy, because what do these academics and Western students, etc., do? They have a two-pronged attack. First of all, they try and deny or diminish the events of October the 7th themselves in order to fit with their narrative that these people are the poor and weak. Or secondly, they have to create this backstory in order to explain it or justify. And both are false, and both need tackling at every stage. And I think the need to change the Western minds is really where the work begins, because without that, I don't even see how you're then going to be able to change the Palestinian minds. And this is one of the key differences between the comparisons with Japan, for example, is that there was consensus in the West as to the fact that Japan needed to change. And there is not consensus in the West. There is not a vast body of opinion among right-minded people, decent people, looking at it objectively, that the Palestinians need to change. So the work does begin here first.
So let's jump into the quote-unquote history the article was trying to say. And this is from the Medium article. I'll put all of them in the description after the show. So it starts with like a story about basically what if someone took over your house and said now it's theirs. And again, that's it's such a bad analogy, mostly because that house would be under same legal system, so you could appeal to the government to basically resolve your conflict, which is just not the case for any sort of international conflict. But sort of skipping on that, they start with the history. While there is a debate as to the biblical origins of Israel and Palestine, what we do know is that long before Israel was recognized as a state, which didn't happen until 1968, Palestine existed. And within Palestine lived the Palestinians. And I think immediately the first sort of quote from this is so misleading. Again, saying Palestine existed implies there was an independent Palestinian state in the region, and basically Israeli pre-IDF groups just came in, started like shooting random people, and violently established a state. There was never such a thing as Palestine. The region was at some points referred to as Palestine. Even when they say Palestinians lived there, I've heard some cases. Oh, doggy! I've heard some cases about basically people in the region being referred to as Palestinians, but when they do so, it just means people in the region. So you had Palestinian Jews, you had Palestinian Christians, you had Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Muslims, just anyone who in a sense was in the region was referred to as Palestinian. And as Marco said, this sort of like Palestinian separate identity only did develop decades later, basically as a sort of answer to Israel establishing itself. But yeah, it starts as terrible. Do you guys have anything to say about this specifically before we go into some of the more fun parts of the history?
I would just say that before there was Columbus who discovered America, there were Native Americans, we call American Indians, living here. I understand that there are idiots around who believe that we need to give up all of America back to the Indians and let them go back to their thing. I also believe that anybody who's practical and realizes how history works and the entire history of humankind works, that when you conquer an area, you conquer it, and that's what it is. And frankly, even setting up reservations for all of their issues in America for the Indians who want to stay in them, and they don't have to, is more than most countries have done historically. So we're not going to start to rewrite human history now, despite the fact that many of these so-called progressives want us to. And we're not going to apply our behaviors today and our so-called enlightened understanding on people and how they behaved hundreds of years ago. But this notion suddenly that people who occupy a land first are the forever God-given, if you believe in that, or somehow international law should protect that land for those people. It's an absurd notion. But the beauty of the way these stories get written is it's sort of taken as a fact or as something that's given, and we all agree on it. These are not self-evident truths. The fact is history is written by the victors, and hopefully the victors are good people and they want people living under them to flourish. But we have no requirement under any system to give back land that might have belonged to somebody else, if it in fact even did. And that's debatable too.
Anything you'd like to say, Marco or Richard?
Just to comment on the use of language and the fact that terms are often deliberately not defined precisely in order to pull this con, isn't it? The same is done with the term refugees to pull this con, as with Palestinians. So it's just a technique of course, it relies on the one hand of people not knowing any level of facts at all and simply responding to stuff based on emotion and acceptance that they like the side that's saying it, rather than verifying the objective facts that side is presenting as well, and understanding the fuller context. But it's the deliberate use of you only need to know this word, learn the word Nakba, learn the word refugee, and all you need to do is Google that, and you're done. That's the technique. It wants you to look through a pinhole vision at what they want you to see, rather than to understand it properly.
And so then it tries to cover the UN partition plan, where it basically it says because the Arab state would be deprived of key agricultural areas and seaports, the Palestinians had to reject the proposal, and with all the other Arab nations declare war on Israel to basically try to completely kick out all of them. This isn't mentioned by the article, of course, but I think almost the funniest part of the article is a bit later. So it basically talks about how Israel was able to establish itself. And then it says, this means that there are Palestinians alive today who actively watch their homeland of Palestine be stolen and renamed to Israel. The other very notable moment of this history is Israel's occupation of Palestine, which officially began in 1967. What does life look like for Palestinians under Israel's occupation, according to Amnesty International? And it goes into that. Have you noticed that Israel had officially began occupation of Palestine in 1967? I wonder what happened there. This article doesn't say. It just said that Israel just began occupation, just randomly. I wonder what must have happened. The amount, and these are the whole purpose of this article is to cover the history didn't start on October 7th. And it completely ignores the Six-Day War, which basically was the occupation. It was the start of the occupation by Israel of Gaza and the West Bank, but it doesn't say what was behind it. It completely ignores the fact that, it could even say it did technically start by Israel, but it was because Egypt had dismissed the UN peacekeeping forces that were in the region to sort of prevent any sort of war. They dismissed them in order to go to war with Israel, but Israel preempted it. But even then, it could have been just a regional conflict between Egypt and Israel, but Jordan and Syria did involve themselves directly, not Israel attacking them, but they did involve themselves directly, which meant Israel also had to go to war with Jordan and Syria, and it did take over West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan, and Golan Heights, which were controlled by Syria. But again, it completely glosses over the fact, and yeah, it's the amount, I'm not sure who mentioned it, but yeah, it's this sort of cherry picking. Like, let's pick the sort of things in history that make sense for us, and let's just go with it. Ignore any context, ignore anything that has happened other than that.
Well, it helps Putin with the justification of taking over the Baltics and the rest of the dissolved USSR, because after all, Russia was part of the USSR, and according to these same people, these amazing progressive people, history started with the USSR, and now it's just poor little Russia all by itself. So let's let Russia take over the rest of the countries, and the heck with the people there.
Marco? Richard?
Well, I was just going to say, of course, in this argument that you're picking on here about when Israel started occupying Palestine, I mean, where's reason and cause and effect in this outlook? It's nowhere to be seen, is it? I mean, these people are irrational, so they take the whim-based motivation as valid. So to them, they can imagine that things just start with a willful decision of Israel to do something. To start a war for the sake of it. They don't question any of it. So it's no surprise, really. It just fits into an overall attitude to how people think or choose to evade thinking.
I mean, you could go down the route of analyzing history. For example, the Ottoman Empire that was occupying the area where Israel and so-called Palestine is now, lost the First War. That part of the land was split between France and
First World War.
First World War, yeah.
You said First War.
Yeah, well. But part of the land was split between France and Britain. Britain gave some of its own land, won through a war, to some people wanted to set up a state in Israel. It wasn't their right, wasn't it? It's their land now, because the other lot they lost. Then come the Second War, the Arabs, what do they do? Again, they joined the losing side by supporting Hitler in order to get the Israeli all killed. They lost again, but despite this, they still do not accept the fact that Israel is a state and it's there and it's not going to go anywhere. That's why they do not want a two-state solution. That's why every time they've given an option to go for a two-state solution, they refuse it. They've done it 4, 5, 6 times. I've lost count now. But they do not want that. Just looking in the West Bank, there is a big kind of picture of the shape of the land, Israeli land, and it's overlaid with a PLO flag. They're clearly telling you they do not want Israel anywhere near what they see at their own land. And despite not having any claim to it, they still call it their own land. And what the hell can you do? I mean, these guys are just argue for the destruction of Israel for the sake, because they're not Muslim, because they're not Arabs. So,
nor do they want peace or Israel to have any form of success. Hence the suppression of the economic cooperation that the Abraham Accords were at least proposing between different countries, that's what must be stopped instantly. I mean, that arguably provided a big motivation for the barbarity of October the 7th, to make sure that that Israel couldn't move towards a more peaceful relationship with its neighbors.
So yeah, history didn't start October 7th, but the war against Hamas did. And it did, because the action that Gaza took. And it's in Israel's interest, and it's actually an existential thing now, that they destroy Hamas and try and push back against the ideology which is all around Israel, which is trying to destroy Israel and everything which is democratic and anti Middle Ages thinking, really.
So there's more things to say about it, but we are running out of time. So let me just read one last text from the article, which I think greatly summarizes at least the article. It says, "While I'm hugely oversimplifying this history, which spans over 100 years at this point, it can be stated pretty simply." I think it definitely is oversimplifying it to the point of basically lying or trying to invent a different history. But that is basically what people who say history didn't start on October 7th do. They either try to use some things that have happened in the past to justify a current genocide against Israelis, and all the atrocities that have happened under October 7th, or they will straight up lie to you. With that, Michael, anything last to say? And also, where can people find you?
Yeah, I think the last comment I'd make is that it's really helpful for people to also focus on where they are and how they're going to get their people to some good place where they can flourish. And it's okay to look back, but frankly, it's way more important to look forward if you want to establish something good. And for those people living in the past, they'll be stuck there. Michael Kaufman, 2Fs, LinkedIn.
Marco and Richard?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with what Michael just said then. I mean, and of course, every time that Israel tries to look forward and tries to do something such as the economic cooperation with neighbors, it's not, it's stamped back down upon by the other side. So you don't need to be referring even to the endless list of atrocities perpetrated on Israel, whether we're going back to the Hebron massacre or the Munich Olympics or the two intifadas. All of that is in the past, and all of that is part of the pattern that has occurred. And October the 7th is the current iteration of that, and it's October the 7th which is the current thing which is motivating what Israel is doing, and it is a desire to prevent it from happening again, so that you can return to peace, so that you can return to people having individual rights and a chance to live out their lives properly.
And to answer your question, you can find us on the ARCUK Substack and the Briefly, what's it called? Briefly Objective, which is a sister channel to this one.
And with that, we have the Atlas Shrugged book club starting pretty much right after this. Also, we'll be back tomorrow with another episode of the Daily Objective and the reality show. Thank you guys for joining me today. Thank you everybody for watching, and bye-bye.